Breaking developments are shaking global headlines as Iran publicly rejects reported negotiations with the United States, contradicting recent claims made in media appearances. Commentators say the contradiction has intensified scrutiny on former President Donald Trump's messaging about the situation, raising questions about whether diplomacy is actually underway or collapsing behind the scenes. At the same time, rising regional tensions, reports of military incidents, and escalating rhetoric from multiple political figures have fueled fears of a broader conflict spiral. Tonight, we break down what was actually said, what Iran's officials publicly denied, and why this clash of narratives could reshape diplomatic strategy and public perception. The central controversy began when Donald Trump, during recent interviews, suggested that discussions with Iran's leadership were ongoing and even productive. Those remarks quickly circulated across political media, framing the moment as evidence that diplomatic channels might still be open despite escalating tensions in the region. But the narrative took a sharp turn when Iranian political figure Ali Larijani publicly rejected that claim, stating that no negotiations were taking place and dismissing the suggestion outright on social media. This immediate contradiction created a powerful political flashpoint. On one side, Trump's messaging implied back-channel diplomacy, a strategy often used in high-stakes geopolitical conflicts. On the other, Iran's public denial signaled either a breakdown in communication or a deliberate refusal to legitimize any negotiations. Analysts note that when diplomatic messaging clashes this openly, it often indicates deeper strategic disagreements rather than simple miscommunication. The controversy intensified because Trump also warned in interviews that casualties could increase if tensions continued, describing the potential cost in stark terms. Supporters interpreted this as realism about the consequences of conflict. Critics, however, framed it as evidence that the situation was escalating beyond political control. The emotional weight of that warning fueled a wider media narrative that the conflict, if real or perceived, might last longer than expected. At the same time, commentators pointed to Trump's comparison of a potential Iran strategy to past approaches used in Venezuela. That reference sparked debate among foreign policy observers, many of whom questioned whether such a model would even apply to Iran's vastly different political and regional structure. Analysts emphasized that Middle East geopolitics involve layers of regional alliances, proxy actors, and historical rivalries that cannot be easily mapped onto another country's political crisis. Adding to the tension were emerging reports of military incidents in the region, including accounts of an F-15 crash allegedly linked to friendly fire. While details remain limited and subject to official confirmation, the reports contributed to a broader perception that the security situation was unstable and unpredictable. In high-pressure geopolitical moments, even unconfirmed or developing incidents can influence public opinion, markets, and diplomatic messaging. Meanwhile, regional activity continued to escalate rhetorically. Various commentators described missile exchanges and retaliatory actions between regional actors, though independent verification remains essential when assessing fast-moving conflict claims. What matters politically is not only what happens on the battlefield, but how leaders communicate those events to domestic audiences. Messaging becomes part of the strategy itself. Another major factor shaping the narrative is how different governments frame responsibility. Iranian officials described their actions as defensive and rejected claims that they initiated aggression, while U.S.-aligned commentators argued the opposite, saying regional proxies and retaliation cycles contributed to the escalation. This mutual blame dynamic is common in geopolitical conflicts, where each side presents its actions as justified responses to perceived threats. The diplomatic divide was further complicated by reports that European allies were hesitant to escalate militarily. Statements suggesting that France would defend its interests but avoid offensive involvement signaled caution among Western partners. Analysts note that such positioning often reflects a desire to prevent regional conflict from expanding into a wider international confrontation. Simultaneously, market reactions underscored how sensitive the global economy is to Middle East instability. Reports of falling futures and rising oil prices illustrated investor concern about prolonged disruption. Economic signals often act as early indicators of geopolitical risk, influencing policy discussions even when official diplomatic channels remain opaque. Another dimension to the story involves domestic political narratives. Critics of Trump argue that strong rhetoric without confirmed diplomatic engagement risks confusing allies and adversaries alike. Supporters counter that tough messaging can be a negotiation tactic intended to pressure adversaries into concessions. Both interpretations highlight how political framing shapes the perception of leadership strength or weakness. Throughout this evolving situation, one consistent theme remains: conflicting narratives about whether diplomacy is alive or collapsing. When one side publicly claims talks are happening and the other rejects that assertion outright, it creates uncertainty not only for policymakers but also for global audiences trying to understand the truth. That uncertainty itself becomes a political weapon, influencing trust, credibility, and strategic leverage. As this clash of messaging continues, the key question becomes whether these contradictions are tactical or structural. If they are tactical, they may reflect negotiation positioning. If structural, they could signal a deeper breakdown in diplomatic pathways. Either scenario carries major implications for how the conflict is managed and how political leaders are judged domestically and internationally. Beyond the immediate dispute over negotiations, the broader political environment surrounding the situation has become increasingly charged. Political commentators and rival policymakers have used the moment to push competing narratives about leadership, strategy, and global alliances. In fast-moving geopolitical crises, public messaging often becomes as important as military or diplomatic actions themselves. One major debate centers on whether strong rhetoric signals decisive leadership or uncontrolled escalation. Supporters argue that projecting firmness can deter adversaries and reassure allies. Critics argue that inconsistent or exaggerated claims risk undermining credibility, especially if contradicted by foreign officials in real time. This credibility gap can influence everything from alliance trust to market stability. Another key issue is the role of regional proxy dynamics. Analysts frequently point out that Middle East conflicts rarely involve only two actors. Instead, they operate through networks of allied groups, militias, and strategic partners. Reports that proxy groups might be activated or responding to regional developments heighten fears that localized tensions could spread geographically. Even when individual claims remain disputed, the perception of widening involvement can shift diplomatic calculations. The narrative is also shaped by rhetoric, from political figures advocating more aggressive military responses. Statements calling for expanded operations against various groups or governments illustrate how domestic political pressures can push foreign policy debates toward escalation. Historically, such rhetoric can influence public opinion, even if actual policy decisions remain more cautious behind closed doors. Meanwhile, diplomatic signaling from global powers like China has added another layer of complexity. Condemnations or criticisms from major nations often reflect broader strategic competition rather than purely regional concerns. When a global power frames U.S. actions negatively, it can signal shifting alignments or attempts to gain geopolitical leverage. Analysts warn that great power competition frequently intersects with regional conflicts, complicating resolution efforts. Economic decisions, such as reported delays in arms sales or military resource allocation, further influence the narrative about priorities and alliances. When such reports surface, they are often interpreted as evidence of shifting strategic focus, whether or not they reflect permanent policy changes. In geopolitical crises, perception frequently drives political reaction as much as confirmed facts. Domestically, public opinion becomes a crucial factor. Polling and commentary suggesting declining support for military escalation can pressure political leaders to adjust messaging or emphasize diplomatic alternatives. Conversely, fear-driven narratives can rally support for stronger action, especially when framed as national security concerns. This tension between restraint and assertiveness defines many modern foreign policy debates. Media coverage also plays a decisive role. Dramatic headlines, viral clips, and real-time social media reactions can amplify certain interpretations while minimizing others. When officials from opposing sides issue conflicting statements within hours of each other, the information ecosystem becomes fragmented. Audiences often choose which narrative to believe based on prior political alignment, further polarizing interpretation of events. In this context, the dispute over negotiations is not merely about whether talks are happening. It reflects a deeper contest over narrative control: who defines reality, whose statements carry credibility, and how public perception shapes diplomatic leverage. Leaders understand that in modern geopolitics, controlling the story can be nearly as powerful as controlling events themselves. Another critical dimension involves risk assessment. If leaders publicly predict prolonged conflict or increased casualties, markets, allies, and adversaries all react accordingly. Such statements can serve as warnings, but they can also be interpreted as signals that diplomatic off-ramps are narrowing. That perception alone can intensify calls for negotiation, or, conversely, preparation for extended confrontation. Finally, the broader lesson from this developing situation is the importance of verified information and cautious analysis. Claims from any political figure, whether about negotiations, military incidents, or strategic plans, must be evaluated alongside official confirmations and independent reporting. In rapidly evolving geopolitical crises, early narratives are often incomplete or contested. As global audiences watch these events unfold, the core question remains unresolved. Are diplomatic channels truly closed? Or is this public clash of statements part of a deeper strategic maneuver? The answer may determine whether tensions cool through negotiation or harden into a longer-term geopolitical standoff. For now, what is clear is that the battle over messaging has become almost as consequential as the events themselves. Stay informed as this story evolves. Subscribe for fact-checked, fast-paced breakdowns of major geopolitical developments and join the conversation on what these conflicting narratives mean for diplomacy, security, and global stability.